My name is Mary Conquest. I'm your host for Safety Labs, the podcast where we explore the human side of safety to support safety professionals. We move past regulations and reportables to talk about the core skills of safety leadership: empathy, influence, trust, rapport. In other words, the soft skills that help you do the hard stuff. This podcast is created by Safety Products Global, the world's leading manufacturer of safety knives. Through our trusted brands, Clever, Slice, and PHC, we empower companies to prevent injuries by providing safer cutting tools for every material and application. Hi there. Welcome to Safety Labs. Safety professionals have a lot of great resources available to them. There are academic research papers, a ton of books, and a robust discussion, both at conferences and online, about new ideas and how to approach safety from different angles. In fact, there are so many ideas that it can be overwhelming. There's a risk of getting stuck between learning new approaches and creating tangible change. Today's guest went from inspiration to action, sometimes with very little budget. We're going to discuss his experience of bridging the gap between learning new theoretical approaches and implementing them. Shawn Connick is the founder of Construct Strategies, a consulting practice dedicated to helping organizations confront their most serious safety risks through human and operational performance, high-energy hazard control, and operational learning. Shawn brings over 30 years of construction and energy leadership, 20 in safety and 15 on the HOP journey, including senior roles supporting complex utility and infrastructure projects across North America. Shawn's work bridges the gap between executives and field crews, creating environments where workers can speak honestly about risk and where leaders learn from the realities of work. He specializes in learning teams, risk assessments, and building sustainable systems that protect people while improving operational performance. And Shawn joins us from Star, Idaho. Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you for having me.
So when we spoke last time, you mentioned kind of what a revelation it was for you years ago to first encounter the work of Todd Conklin and Sidney Dekker. You said that they gave you language to describe concepts you'd been observing and thinking about. But then immediately following that, you had the realization that you had to figure out how to operationalize these ideas, and quickly. Can you set the scene and tell us a little bit about kind of that time in your career, that realization, and what you did next?
Sure. I started out my career in the environmental consulting side and then moved into project management and construction. And from there, at that company, I moved into safety. So as I was getting into safety, and I had good operational experience and understood how the business worked really well, but was learning safety, very traditional safety, from a mentor that kind of came from that old school safety. And it just didn't resonate. It came across as condescending. Many of the things that we were asking people to do, such as publicly apologize or stand downs of those things, didn't seem like they really have any long-term impact. And it just felt uncomfortable with it. I was learning about some behavior-based safety at the time, which had some interesting ideas, but in practice, it really seemed to struggle. So as I was kind of learning this traditional safety, like coincidence, like a lot of things in life, I can't remember which comes first, but somebody handed me Sidney Decker's Field Guide to Understanding Human Error. And as I read that, it started to give me a language of what I was seeing and started to kind of lay it out, kind of what I was seeing, some of the psychology, some of the organizational thoughts behind that, and kind of what that was. Now, Sidney's fantastic. He's antagonistic. He's an interesting writer, an interesting personality, but he's an academic. So, this is early on, not too long after he'd written that book. And what do you do with that information? It's very tough to take that book and do something with it. It's about the same time before Todd Conklin had written his first book that I saw him at a small user conference. And again, he started to use language that made sense to me. And Todd started to make that connection, I think, between the hypothetical, the academic, and more the practical. That was his experience. So I really then just started to read and try to understand and go see these folks. This was kind of very early on in what we call HOP now, just trying to understand all of that myself and trying to kind of slowly put it into action. Because at the time, as I was talking to my senior executives at my company and trying to explain what this was, the first question I got is, anybody else doing this? Is anybody else construction doing this? And I thought, I couldn't find anybody. I talked to Todd Conklin at one point in time, and he said he wasn't really aware. So it was really kind of pushing the edge on things and kind of pushing operational leadership to an area that they hadn't really thought of or been comfortable with before. And it wasn't until I got a new leader that really started to take a look at this and go, hey, I'm really worried about something happening. I don't think we're doing enough.
So at the time, you had a relatively limited budget to make any changes. How did that limitation or affect the way that you decided to move forward once the organization was ready to do some implementation?
Yeah. So what I really wanted to focus on was kind of trying to change the whole organization, not just safety, really getting the buy-in of the ownership and the operational leadership. So making sure that I was very strategic and that when I had opportunities to bring in people for training, because we're just a mid-sized company, so relatively, moderate budget. They're very generous, but still a moderate budget. So really when I could bring people in is getting leadership and as many people in kind of the upper ranks of the organization into that to try to get the buy-in and understanding of what I was doing study action teams, which is essentially kind of a lean book club where you're reading some of these books. I would have my safety team at the time, about 8 of us, so not a very large safety team. We would pick up books. One of the folks I worked with suggested the Sidney Decker's Safety Anarchist. So we'd read that together to kind of explore the ideas amongst ourselves, where you're just taking the book and breaking it down into 4 or 5 parts, and then you have a call over, every 2 or 3 weeks and kind of work through the book. And it gives you some opportunity to really discuss these ideas. For a lot of folks, I mean, this is a huge change in what they've done before. And kind of after it happened, I realized it took really about 18 months of those conversations just within the safety department, where I had a lot of control, where there wasn't a whole lot of interest in, from outside of what I was doing for these kind of granular things. So it's really trying to change that day-to-day practice of what you do as a safety person. If you start to really read and understand the philosophy behind these things, you can look at a lot of the activities that we do as safety professionals, particularly post bad thing, post event, and how we look at things, investigate things, are not particularly effective, probably in risk management, and certainly not effective in the operational learning realm.
Okay, so let's talk about learning teams because I think you implemented those fairly quickly, maybe after this sort of almost incubation period within the safety department. So first of all, how did you get the supportive leadership to start using learning teams? How did you explain it to them?
I would explain it to them. I would use Todd's books, one of Todd Conklin's books. Bob Edwards hadn't published his book at that point in time. I got some traction, and it really was getting the right person that maybe was a little bit of I don't want to say younger in age, but newer leadership in that position of overseeing safety, feeling like, hey, I just see what we're doing, and I'm not comfortable that we're doing a quality enough job as an organization to learn from these things. We sit in these incident reviews. We're using a modified TAP route, which I found very valuable at the time. But you're coming up with management commitment, didn't follow instructions and proper procedure. You're coming up with all of these things over and over and over, and it feels a little bit like Groundhog Day. And you just kind of having happen over and over. And so as we started to teach the executives about this operational learning concepts and about learning teams in particular, talking about what a learning team is requires you to talk about the environment that people in, how they communicate, having peers in the room, having senior management in the room with a field worker, what that does to the relationship as far as talking and opening. So all of the learning team philosophies and processes and tools that you use in a learning team, you can also extrapolate back into the learning process of your normal investigations, and you can teach executives to that. And so what I started to do in addition to the learning teams is really try to use this mindset, particularly for minor, moderate injuries, near misses where they're not as high pressure. And you just start to talk differently and act differently. And I think over a period of time, the operational leadership just saw that they were getting better information about what was actually happening in the field, even though it's uncomfortable many times because it's not what you expect to happen. But they just found that the value in is a business leader knowing what's going on in your organization because we just don't have much of a feedback loop in construction traditionally.
So you You chose learning teams as a bit of a first step. I think you called them low hanging fruit. So, my question is, why are they low hanging fruit? Like, what makes them easy as a starting point for change?
Well, I don't know that the learning teams themselves are low hanging fruit. I think it's the topics that you choose when you first start them. I think often when folks start learning teams, they want to pick this big topic. They're looking to solve all the world's problems, maybe in one learning team, the first learning team. So I pick low hanging fruit is, one of the first learning teams we did was headed towards a project, headed towards a particular task of installing concrete formwork for a high rise where you repeat this process 50 times. And so we did this learning team to bring in foremen to come in and talk about these forming systems. They all had experience in downtown Los Angeles building concrete high rises, tremendous amount of experience. So heading into the project to begin to talk to them about their experience with various forming works and the manufacturers and how they work, what's efficient, what kind of building we're building, and how that would interact. So that is low hanging fruit because you don't have that kind of emotional thing that comes along with post safety incidents, potentially where somebody's been hurt. That just raises the emotions. So when I say low hanging fruit, I mean kind of the easier topics. Maybe it's a minor injury. Near misses are wonderful because that's your golden opportunity to learn about a process, and nobody's been hurt yet. And so I think that's the low hanging fruit is where the expectation coming out of that learning team is not so high. That's where I've seen a lot of problems is people want to do a learning team. They want this big topic, and you try to tell them, hey, it's a little bit big of a topic. Let's kind of scope this down. And there's a resistance to that. So start with scoping small.
You also mentioned that learning teams, while they're a great tool, are not a silver bullet. Can you expand on, like, you've just mentioned that high stakes isn't maybe the place to start with them. But can you expand on the idea that they're not a catch-all? They're not going to work for every situation.
Yeah, I think that there's a few things in there. I think that it can be such a big improvement on the information you get from our traditional investigation methods, right? So people think, oh, wow, I can fix everything. We have limited resources. You only can only work on so many problems with so many resources at one time. So it can be overwhelming in the amount of change or information you get that you have to sort through that. Because a lot of the problems we run into are not necessarily that we didn't have the information, but maybe we're not making the change that we've suggested we've made before, and it's just coming up in another way. So you have to deal with that problem is how we make changes within the organization. So it won't fix that. It just corrects the information or brings you better information. You still have to have a robust process to fix those things. If you don't, it will seem like it was a silver bullet that didn't do anything. I think sometimes, there's certainly a lot of consultants out there selling hop these days. Not sure how much operational experience they have. And I think sometimes it's sold as, this really great thing, and people are not thinking about the steps that it takes to get there. It took me a good 18 months of working on senior leadership to get to the point that we could do these on a regular basis. People's feelings weren't hurt. It was good information that we just felt differently about the information we were getting. We just lacked a little bit of sensitivity about the information. It's good information. You stop asking about who the people are involved, what the project was. You're just interested in what you will learn. So I think people, and then they leave it to safety. Many times in organizations, in an organization I worked for recently, which really was owned by the safety department. So it becomes kind of another safety thing. And I encountered in my rollout in the first company I rolled this out, really for the first year, people are waiting for you to replace the program in the following year. They're really waiting for that because that's what you have traditionally done in safety is like you have your new program. So you have your new program, they're waiting for the second year. So sometimes it takes almost 2 years before they believe you that it's not going away and it's not a flavor of the year. So it's all of these complex things rather than just rolling it out and saying, oh, well, these learning things is going to fix everything. It's part of a cultural change.
So now that you've had years of experience, how would you, this is an odd way to phrase it, but how would you describe your relationship with learning teams? Like, are you implementing them in the same way now as when you first started, or have you changed your approach over time?
Yes, I've changed my approach over time. I think when I first started them, I was very, very worried that people would talk to me and open up. How honest are they going to be? But if you follow the process, you read Bob Edwards and Andrea Baker's book, and they do a great job of lining out the kind of the practical aspects. You follow those practical aspects and get peers in a room that's comfortable and start that conversational model and write stuff on the board. It works. So I have found that to be easier than I originally thought. Transitioning into kind of improvements and understanding kind of that and the people and how they kind of view that. I've learned a little bit about that, and I think that's just practice. The part I've really changed is that report out to the operational leadership. When I first started this, I didn't kind of have a scoping document. It was more conversation. It was more casual, and we would do the learning team. I've learned in the past 4 years that really having a better scope of the people who want the learning team, the operational folks that want the learning team, in addition to the senior safety folks, having them write down a problem statement of what the problem is that they want to solve. That was really interesting. That really took a lot of time to teach people. And I don't mean a great big deal of time, but it takes some practice of a few times to write that, because often people have problem statements, or they want me to essentially go in and do a learning team and please tell me how to make these people safe or that they'll follow the rules. That's not a problem statement, right? You need something more granular. I need to learn about how they perform this task. So it's not about the problem statement. It's not about the fix. It's about wanting to learn about the problem. So that was the big transition, really, is people having to want to learn about the problem and not so much focus kind of on the fix.
It actually reminds me of, I don't know, I have this SNL character in my head who, no matter how complex the problem, he would just yell, "Fix it."
And I think we traditionally do that, right? What's the traditional kind of management thing that I heard younger in my career? Don't come to me with a problem unless you have a fix. Well, that's not an open door, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, they're
True.
actually literally asking you to fix a problem you may know nothing about, and I think that's traditional safety. We've been asked to fix problems, and I know that I have very much emotionally felt connected to when something bad goes happen, that I am part of the failure. Well, now I understand that I'm part of the system, probably not the very specific failure, and so I think it allows me a better kind of view in stepping back. I think as I was taught in traditional safety, kind of particularly post bad thing that happens is that, you just get really granular after something bad happens. You get very close in to look at the specifics, hand placements, the last few activities that maybe happened before an incident occurred. Todd said this early on is like that's the least interesting part of the incident. The energy's been released, somebody's been hurt, something's happened. It takes a while to actually understand and believe that and see it. And like that isn't the most interesting thing. So you step back to 5,000, 10,000 foot view and start to see how the organization is working. And we talk about, well, people made bad choices. When you step back, you start to see, did they have good choices? What were the choices? Were the choices clear? Were we clear what kind of choices we gave them? It just gives you a better understanding of what the organization is going on in that organization. So, as safety professionals, it's important to look at the very specific things sometimes, but often we don't step back quickly enough and say, what's the bigger picture? Or we get focused kind of on this risk management journey of that we think we're collecting information that will help us with the regulators or any litigation or anything of that like that. And in my experience, I find that most of that is just not true. That if you spend time working with those folks, I worked in California for many years, had some experience in litigation as a general contractor. Most of our documentation is good or bad. You just never know. And a good attorney can make it look, good or bad. So focus on learning. That's the most important thing.
Is there anything that you think safety professionals commonly get wrong about learning teams?
I think the thing that I'm seeing in the past few years is starting to call many things that learning teams. So using maybe a 5 why method, that making a few adaptations and calling it a learning team. So that's what I've seen really in the past few years is people taking their old processes, maybe making a few minor adjustments, maybe not at all, and calling them learning teams. And the organizations I've worked in, I've said it's really like, look, for just a basis of understanding so that we're all speaking similar language. Let's use Todd and Bob and Andrea's kind of process as a foundation. That's not to mean that there's not other ways that you can do it. But I think it's helpful when you're in an organization, or if you're involved in other organization groups that you're talking about this, that we kind of keep the definition pretty close to what Tom, Bob, and Andrea have, because I think it works. I haven't found anything better. There's a small few tweaks here and there, but I've run into people that want to do, just record it and put it into Chat GPT, and they just want to call all this stuff learning teams. The learning team process and kind of the informal nature of it, writing things on the board, having conversations, it's all very intentional. It's not about being the most efficient. It's about making connection to people and learning their stories and getting quality information. It's not about trying to do it as quickly as possible. So that's where I'm seeing some problems with that.
So we touched a little bit on dealing with leadership earlier, and I want to come back to an idea that you mentioned when we last spoke, which was safety fluency and developing safety fluency in an organization. So, first of all, how would you describe safety fluency?
Safety fluency, I think, is being able to not just support the ideas. A lot of times we'll have people say, yeah, they support us. Well, that's not fluency. Fluency is being able to have a conversation with somebody. If you're talking about HOP or you're talking about safety, it's HOP, that you can have a conversation about the principles. You don't have to be an expert, but you can have a conversation and know what the person's talking about. I've seen it rolled out in organizations where it's rolled out in, kind of very traditional safety online or traditional safety class, and it's kind of a one and done. And there's no level of fluency or follow up. They don't really know how to apply any of those things because for many folks, it's a new language. So applying that can be difficult with that language.
I think language is a perfect metaphor because, if you watch a webinar on how to speak German, it doesn't mean you speak German.
Correct.
There's a lot more to, if assuming you hadn't before.
Yeah, and early on in my safety career, I was not as careful with my language and paying attention to what my words meant or what kind of reaction they might elicit from another person. I just wasn't that conscious of it now. And now I'm more conscious of it. I think about it. I'm far from perfect, but I can kind of self-analyze. Edgar Schein's Humble Inquiry is a fantastic book to kind of get you to self-reflect a little bit how you communicate with people. Am I having conversations to learn or to prove my point? So you can learn kind of all of these skills and improve a lot. I don't think you can change who you are, but there are some tools and skills that you can learn to improve that all tie into this HOP thing that, again, can tie into how you just normally do safety and then how you interact with your executives as well. I think in having empathy for those executives and trying to understand what their day-to-day pressures are, maybe from their client as well.
Are there predictable or common stages of maturation when it comes to organizations and their safety practice?
I think that we talk about language. It really is the language. When folks within a safety organization, let's talk about the safety professionals as the group, when they can start to have common language, when they can start to have common language about forward-leaning kind of ideas that are new out there, that's when you really start to see that. And then if they can have that common language with, say, the operation folks at their level, because you might have a field safety person that's dealing with superintendent and foreman. So they can create that common language, then start to kind of share that common language. Because there's always, most safety folks know that there's a lot of bad things that happen that we don't record, just little things that are happening all the time. So if you can use that language and these kinds of things in your communication, that will really help that maturation. So you can really, the best thing that I can see that I've seen in the maturation, because it's hard to see in numbers, is really just the language that you begin to use. It's using the language on a regular basis, which again concerns me a little bit about the learning teams, because learning teams are not something you do frequently to start with, certainly. And if you're not using the language and the skills behind those and the tools, then you're not ready to deal with the bigger topics. So it's really that maturation so that when we talk about things normally. So, and I think one big thing you start to see is a small thing, but I found it really noticeable, is that when people stop talking about what was the story of how somebody got hurt, what was the story? Why did that happen? Because it's not that interesting, because you start to learn that I can talk to 5 people that were there. I'm going to get 5 different stories. They all saw, heard different things. And you can stop just minimize the amount of time you try to figure out learning the story. The story's not that important. It's what we learn from the event and can improve. We as humans like to hear that story, right? We like to know that we want to know what the story is. We want to know what the dirt is. That's what we read a newspaper. But in this particular case, it can be a lot of wasted effort in trying to develop lessons learned, but they're trying to tell a story. So everybody's trying to kind of combine and stories and trying to kind of come up with a story that everybody agrees to. When you start to leave that behind, you can you can see the maturation of that because it's not that important. It's not a good use of your effort.
So it sounds like, I say maturation, fluency, they're kind of the same thing. So let's say you go into as a consultant or an organization that has perhaps less safety fluency than you'd like. How can you start to build that fluency?
I think the easiest thing is through articles, some podcasts, or these books where it's pushed by some leadership element. I did these study action teams, which are a book club. I've seen things done where, like, you listen to a podcast, maybe a 20-minute podcast, and as part of your staff meeting, you're going to develop 15 minutes to talk about these new concepts so that you devote time to talking about the concepts. You've done two things there. You've devoted the time, which is very helpful, but the leadership is telling you they have an expectation that you spend that time to learn about these concepts rather than the kind of one class, you've taken the class, you're done. No successful cultural change or big change is just done with one class, one books. It takes a process of continuous conversation. That's the big change I see kind of in the safety world, and that safety kind of maybe many years we've been insular in kind of what we do, and you take our class and you're done. Maybe it's first aid or those kinds of, there's not kind of a continuing discussion of something different. It's kind of a program for the year. So I think that the way that we work as safety professionals is changing a lot. And in fact, that sometimes is the more resistant group that I have when I'm talking about these concepts or my peers.
So, what can safety learn from looking at non-safety events, particularly operational events?
Well, I think operational events particularly may tell you further upstream what a problem is, right? They may identify problems in the system before somebody's hurt. I mean, once you start to do these learning teams, when you're going and during a learning team, you're not just learning about safety. You're learning about the work, which encompasses the production, the quality, and the safety. The conversation is not broken up into three parts. It's a fluid conversation. So that when you're looking at it from that standpoint, that's what's really helpful, is to look at it as kind of one chunk of work. And then we're just learning about that, and we improve operations, we improve safety, and we improve quality. I've never had a learning team where we didn't learn some aspect of that for every one of them, because it's part of the natural story of work and they all affect each other.
What are your thoughts about the importance of sustainability and scalability when it comes to different safety initiatives? You mentioned earlier that sometimes there's an expectation of like flavor of the year.
Yeah, first chunk of my career, I was along with everybody else in kind of the flavor of the year. You kind of look at what your history is, maybe from the past year, 3 years, whatever that may be, maybe in a serious incident. And that certainly dictates the flavor of the year that you're going to have, whether it's driving, training, stretch of the flex, those kinds of things. They may or may not continue. And if they continue, they may not continue with any robustness. So it's really just trying to keep the process going where you're continually talking about it.
Yeah, I suppose that in terms of sustainability, if you're talking very narrowly about an incident, it's not the same as the sustainability of incorporating new ways of thinking and processes. Those can continue on for decades, right?
Yeah, I mean, they are different but very similar. And the scalable sustainability can talk about any program that we introduce to the organization. What's the effort of the people involved, the financial repercussions of it, what's it cost the organization, how much value does it provide? Because if it doesn't have value, it usually doesn't sustain over a period of time. If you have a small organization, or you have an organization to small projects versus big projects, can I scale up? If you're in a multinational organization, how can I scale that down to maybe different cultures? It's just taking a look at all of that. That's your bigger picture. But I also see it post-incident when we come up with these fixes, these problem solvers, whatever it is, and you start to read into it, and you wonder, and in my experience, sometimes you're like, "Geez, can we really do that? Can we really do that? And will we be doing that in a year?" Or if you're around long enough, and a year or two later, you're like, "Gosh, we don't even do that anymore." You go back to look at an old document because you have to make changes. Like, "Geez, we stopped doing that 2 years ago." So, with anything I've done, I think just through kind of the school of hard knocks and beating my head against the wall is to try to evaluate anything I do, regardless of HOP or any program I introduce the organizations I've worked at or who I work with now as clients, is like, can you scale this up and is it sustainable for you? Because if you don't feel it is it worth your effort? Maybe you ought to relook at something else and adjust.
Do you have any advice for safety professionals who are trying to essentially bootstrap safety programs, maybe who have quite limited resources?
Yeah, I mean, I think you just have to read, listen to podcasts. You've got to spend time on your own learning about these things. I mean, I am frustrated on occasion by, my peers that, aren't aware of these new ideas, haven't read a kind of leading edge safety book in years. They don't listen to any podcasts. They're not reading, the National Safety Council or, the American Society of Safety Professionals, any of that doc. They're not keeping up with all the stuff that's coming out. This is a really rich time right now of new stuff coming to us. Dr. Matt Hallowell at CSRA is doing some really interesting things, and again, I don't necessarily agree with everything that everybody's doing, but there's a lot of creative information coming out there that I think as a safety professional, it is more important you stay up on top of what's happening there than always thinking about just being a cop on the beat walking the job. You have to split that field time with your job as a safety professional and know what's going on out there in the safety world. So a lot of different organizations, there's a lot of different companies. As I've gotten older, I do realize that when I said, years earlier in my career that, oh, those people are different, that company is different. They're not so different. We're all working with people. We all have people challenges. Certainly, we have task differences and industry differences, different industry challenge. I come from construction, which has some different challenges than, say, a fixed facility. But again, you're still dealing with people and processes.
When it comes to the next generation of safety professionals, so right now there's quite a few programs you can take, academic programs to train you for this kind of a career. Where would you focus the training?
Mary, that is a tough question. I have hired interns or hired folks out of college as much as I could over the years. I believe in the profession we have. And I am often frustrated when I ask about kind of what they're learning is that they're not learning the deeper philosophies, whether going back to Taylorism, behavior-based safety, HOP, human performance, all of these philosophies which have been around a long time. They're not learning about kind of the fundamentals. They tend to learn more about the regulatory structure, which is important, but I don't think is as important understanding the philosophies. So if you're getting a safety degree, I would probably really try to take classes, look at programs that delve deeper into philosophy, that are going to be talking about Decker. They're going to be talking about Taylorism. They're going to be talking about James Reason, giving you some background and kind of the psychology and the organizational thinking. So in my experience, the best kind of background is kind of that organizational thinking and some of that psychology tied in kind of with the safety training. And I think you can self-teach yourself on some of these things as well. If you're a safety professional that already has a degree, maybe it's, it's not a related degree, you're not going to get another degree. You could educate yourself. There's so much good stuff out there. There are really good conferences out there. It's a really good time to be looking into these things now.
Yeah, I have to say, not just for safety, there's never been a time with more information available to us. You have to sift sometimes to find the good information, but that's part of the learning too, is deciding, you know, what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, for example, you can take incident report information and put it in ChatGPT and say, is this a counterfactual, right? Am I actually, what is my learning in here? How am I writing this? Just to kind of double check yourself and kind of like, are you really learning? You know, I wrote this report. How does it compare to these principles? Am I in sync with those? It's really interesting that you can use some of that to really help you in your journey and kind of reflect on some of your language you're using.
And your peers as well, I would.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
it's really good.
If you could go back in time, and here's a tougher question, to the beginning of your safety career, what is one piece of advice that you might give yourself?
Be patient, have more patience. Don't get as angry at the situation. Try to, again, step back and look at the pressures that everybody are under, including myself as a young safety person. So give myself a little more grace and others a little more grace. Those people out there working hard, man. I just, the longer I've done this, I just haven't seen many people that show up to do a bad job. They're trying to do their job under a lot of difficult circumstances. So give them grace, give yourself grace, and be patient. And listen.
I would say, yes. I mean, I agree. I think a lot of us learn patience as we get older, regardless. But also, I mean, it's a sign of passion, right? If you're frustrated, it means that you care, which is not a bad thing.
No, I've been asked, gosh, how did you keep doing this for so many years? I mean, it was 5 or 6 years before I got any traction at my first company. I just couldn't be satisfied with the status quo. I knew it could be better, and I was just gonna step on those toes occasionally and keep it going. I'm just a little bit of a pain in the ass sometimes that way.
So, how can our listeners learn more about any of the topics in our discussion today? You've mentioned a few books. Are there any other books, websites, organizations that you recommend to people?
Yeah, I've got some fundamental things that I recommend that, again, I think are fundamental books, and it's Sidney Decker's Field Guide to Understanding Human Error. There's a couple editions. It's more of an academic read. That's not something you want to listen to on a book on tape, as I've been told, but it's so valuable. And he's written many since then, and I've kept up with some, but that's a fundamental book. Todd Conklin's, his Human Performance Principles, excellent. A short read that again is a must. And then Bob Edwards, Andrea Baker's book on learning teams. I think those 3 books, if you read those 3 books, you'll have a really decent understanding of what we're talking about. And then in addition to that, there's a lot of folks doing a lot of driving, a lot of traveling. Todd Conklin's, his pre-accident investigation podcast is wonderful. Andrea Baker's podcast is wonderful. I listen to those 2 on a regular basis. There are many other ones out there. So I'm going to suggest those are not the only ones, but listen to things, read things, sign up for CSRA, some big organizations, and just kind of keep reading articles and books on a regular basis. And I ebb and flow like everybody else. Sometimes I read more than others. And there are some non-safety things that I think tie in really well. Freakonomics is a great podcast. It talks about economic behavior and human behavior, which ties into the HOP thing in a kind of interesting way. So there is lots of stuff out there. Keep learning.
Where can our listeners find you on the web?
Shawn Connick. LinkedIn is probably the best way to contact me. You can link up the link to my website there. Reach out to me. It's probably the best way to learn about me, and we could reach and connect if we want to.
Okay. Well, we've come to the end of another great episode. Thanks so much for chatting with me, Shawn.
Thank you.
And listeners, thank you for listening. Thank you to the Safety Labs team for everything you do. Bye for now. This podcast is created by Safety Products Global, the world's leading manufacturer of safety knives. Through our trusted brands, Clever, Slice, and PHC, we empower companies to prevent injuries by providing safer cutting tools for every material and application. Until next time, stay safe.